Welcome back to the channel, everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can host your own website. It's going to cost very little. In fact, as long as you stick within the free tier for AWS and the Cloudflare free account, the only thing that you'll have to pay for is registering your domain. We're going to be leveraging Amazon's simple storage service, also known as S3, to host our static website files. And then we're going to be configuring our domain with Cloudflare, setting up SSL, and directing all of the traffic to our website to our S3 bucket that we're hosting everything on via Cloudflare. Cloudflare offers a number of security features which make it ideal for our use case. So this is a great project. And just before I get started on the tutorial, I just want to touch on why you would want to do this, because you could set up a LinkedIn, you could set up a GitHub profile, but at the end of the day, this gives you a lot of creative license to do exactly what you want. You can really express yourself. So in that sense, it's a great first project. And if you have been working in software for years, it's a great way to showcase your skills and have your specific blog or your projects or whatever it may be available, and all at little to no cost. So let's get started. All right, so to get started, we're going to create our project directory, and then inside the project directory, we're going to create a directory called dist. That's the directory that we're going to be distributing, specifically uploading to the Amazon S3 bucket. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm working out of my home directory. You can work out of whichever directory you'd like. You can change to your home directory with cd tilde. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new directory. I'm just going to call that our website project. Let's change directory into that website project directory. Now, this will of course be empty if you run ls, or I'm running ls/lah, those flags being L for list, A for all, and H for human readable. In case your output looks a little bit different, that's why. So in here, I'm going to create a new directory. It's going to be called dist. And then in here, I'm going to create another directory within the dist directory called static. That's where we're going to host our style.css file. And if you add images or icons, logos, and so forth to your website, you would typically add it there to that static directory. So let's do that. We're changing there. We're going to say make there, and we're going to call this static. Now let's just head back. Make sure that you're in the dist directory. Clear this, and we're going to create the entry point to our website. It's going to be called index.html. So we can do that using the touch command, and we're going to call it index.html. Let's have a look at that file. You can use the editor that you would like. I'm using NeoVim. It's not important though. And in here, we've got a blank file. So I'm going to load in an HTML template that you can also use, which I will link, of course, to the video. And just for reference, HTML, or hypertext markup language, is the standard for markup language within web pages. Okay, so in front of you is a very vanilla HTML5 template. And as you can see, it includes, or it encompasses, some basic tags. We've got the HTML tag. Here I put EN for English, to indicate that this web page is going to be in English. We've got the char set, which is UTF-8, then some information about the viewport and so forth. Not that important. Here under title, you can add a title to your website. This is going to be what shows up in the browser tab. And then you can also add your own name as the author, as well as some keywords for search engine optimization. Down here, you've got your static directory for your files that we're going to be serving. As I mentioned, we're going to have style.css so that we can add some basic styling to our website. And then here is the body of what's actually displayed in the web page. Under the header, we've got our website name, we've got some main content, and then a footer, which I've just included this copyright symbol, and then all rights reserved. Of course, this is for you to play around with and customize and make your own. This is just a very, very simple HTML template. So that's all looking pretty good. Let's go and have a look at what it looks like. So we're going to get out of this, and now we can open this in our default browser using xdg config if we're on a Linux system. So you can simply say xdg-open index.html, and we can see here that our website is looking pretty bland at the moment. So why don't we give it a styles file? We've already created the static directory. So I'm going to cd into static. And in here, we're going to touch a style.css file. And once again, we'll go in there. We're expecting it to be empty, right? So just to read you through it, we've got a body. I've got this kind of light gray. We've got 0 margin because by default, HTML applies some margin. And then we've got our header, which is going to be this component here with the website name in it. And then we're going to say that we want space around and a height of that of 10. So we can have a kind of look at this. If we wanted to say this is background is, say, red, we can see the height of this. So come over here and refresh this. Okay, so once we've spelled it correctly, you can see that this is a height of 10 view height. So we've got 100 view height units that we can work with. So there we've allocated 10. And just so you can see, I'm also going to put the footer. The footer down here has also got 10. So if I say background blue, we refresh this here, you're going to see, okay, so we've got 10 here, and the body comprises the remaining 80 view height units. So I'm going to get rid of those colors because I don't think they add much, and you can go ahead and you can customize this to your heart's content. Just wanted to demonstrate that. And so we've got these basic styling. So the website name, the content, and then we've got this footer down the bottom. Looking pretty good. So now we're ready to upload these files to the Amazon S3 bucket. And of course, to do that, we're going to need to have an AWS account. So let's go and create one. Let's go and set up our Amazon Web Services account. So I'm just going to put in here, AWS free tier. It's going to come up with the first link. We just hit there. You're going to be presented with this create free account. Due to the sensitive nature of this, I'm not going to walk through the sign up process, but it's very straightforward. Go ahead and take yourself through the steps. It will ask for payment details, but we're going to be in the free tier, remember. So unless you exceed a certain threshold, you'll never be charged. Go ahead and I'll see you on the other side. All right, so now we're logged in for the first time into our new AWS free tier account. But the thing is that we're logged in as a root user, and AWS documentation always tends to encourage us, where we're using AWS resources, to use an IAM role, an identity access managed role. That means a role that we're going to create for specific users that are going to be using specific services. So rather than use our root account, we're going to create a new user, and that user is going to be an admin. I'm going to be accessing both the AWS graphical user interface known as the console, and I'm also going to be running commands from AWS's AWS CLI tool, which we're going to install in a moment. And the reason I'm doing it with the CLI is I just find that the CLI is often much easier to use, but we are going to come back at the end and see exactly what we've done in AWS. So we'll be able to go and have a look at the S3 bucket that we've created, have a look at the policy permissions and everything that we've set up using the CLI. So there's not a right or wrong way here. You can either use the console or you can use the CLI. But the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a user. And the way that we're going to do that, so we're in our root account here. My root account is called the Rad Lectures. We're going to search for a service, and it's called IAM. Click on IAM, and you will see that probably in your case, it may say that you need to set up multi-factor authentication. I'd highly encourage you to do that. So go ahead and do that if you haven't. Now, down here, you can see we've got no user groups and we've got no users. And typically, the best way to do this is to create a user group and then assign users to that user group. I'm going to create an administrators user group, and then I'm going to create an admin user who is going to have access to that user group or is going to be assigned to that group. So let's do that. Here under user groups, I'm going to create a new group. We're going to call it administrators. And down here, I'm going to simply provide admin access. Now, you always want to adhere to the principle of giving or granting the least amount of required privileges. So I'm going to be using this CLI user and the user for accessing the AWS console for many, many more use cases beyond what we're doing here. But if you're only using CLI access, then you may want to create a CLI group for specific tasks, like S3 might be granted to that group. Okay, so now we've got our administrators group. We're going to go and create a new user. And I'm simply going to call this user admin. And down here it says provide user access to the AWS management console. This is optional. So in this case, I am going to be using this login to access the AWS management console, just to go in and have a look at the services and resources that we're using, specifically in the case of this tutorial, the simple storage service that we're setting up. And I'm going to specify that I want to create an IAM user. I'm going to auto-generate a password, and I'm not going to require that user have their password reset, because this is actually myself in this case. All right, and now I'm going to add this user admin to the administrators group. And we're going to create the user. And this is going to be our console sign in. So go ahead and grab that link, and also grab the password, because you're going to be signing out of our root account in a moment and back in as an admin. So now let's return to our users list. And if we have a look here, we can see we've got one user admin. They belong to the admin administrators user group, and we're almost ready to go. So now the next step is we need to install the AWS command line interface to our local system, because that's where we're going to be running our commands to set up our S3 bucket. Let's go ahead and let's do that. All right, so we're back. Now we're in the terminal, and we want to install the AWS CLI. I'm using Arch Linux, but you could be using Ubuntu or Mac OS or Fedora, or whatever it may be. But specifically in the case of Arch, we want to install the AWS CLI v2. We don't want to install version 1. So for that reason, I'm going to be using this package in the Arch user repository, and I'm going to be using Paru for that. So I'm going to go with Paru, SYU, and then AWS CLI, and then v2. This might take a moment because I haven't updated for a bit, so let's just wait. Okay, so our installation is complete, and we can check our AWS version with AWS -- version. And we can confirm that we're using version 2 of the AWS CLI, which is what Amazon Web Services recommends. Now we're ready to create our AWS credentials, our keys, so that we can access resources belonging to our AWS account from the command line. On the right-hand side, you can see the AWS documentation for creating an IAM user for command line interface access. And we've already done step 1 just a moment ago. We created our IAM user, which we called admin, and we attached the administrators policies via attaching this user to the administrators group. As you can see, that most of the tutorials on Amazon really revolve around the S3 service that we're going to be using. So you could just provide the Amazon S3 full access policy. It's up to you. It's generally better, as I mentioned, to have fewer or grant only accesses to those resources that your user requires. Now, the second step is that we need to get access keys for our user. So we can sign into the management console, and we can open up the console, and then we can create these access keys. So let's go and do that. We're going to be going to the users page, and then security credentials, and then under access keys, we're going to create an access key. So let's go and do that. Here, I'm going to back in the console in our IAM service. I'm going to go to the username. I'm going to go to security credentials. And under access keys, I'm going to create access key. And our use case is going to be the command line interface. All right, so this information is important, so don't close the tab. We go back to our instructions, and now we can see that we need to configure the AWS CLI. Now, it's important that you keep this information protected. I'm, of course, going to be removing this user and resetting all of these keys after the tutorial. But in your case, you don't want to expose these keys to anyone, because if they were to get access to them, they could access your AWS account, they could spin up resources, and they could exploit that. So be very careful with these keys. Now, we've got to configure the AWS CLI that we just installed, and we can use that, do that using AWS configure. So back in our terminal, we can simply go AWS configure. So we can see that it's asking for our AWS access key ID. So let's come back in here. Let's grab that and hit enter. Now it's going to ask for the secret access key. So we can paste that in here. And as I mentioned, be especially careful with who you expose this to. Now, with respect to our regions, we can have a look at the different regions, but typically I'm going to be in Asia Pacific, in Singapore in my case, so that's AP-Southeast-1, but you could choose the region that's closest to you. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then finally, we can just simply use JSON JavaScript object notation as our default output and hit enter. So now that's going to be all done, and we can go ahead and have a look at that with our AWS configure. Now you can see that this has all been put under a default profile. So had we specified a profile, well, we could have put this under a specific profile, but in our case, default is enough, because when we run the command, it's going to default to these credentials that we've supplied here. We run AWS configure again, we'll see that we already have the access key ID, we have the secret access key, we have a region, and we also have the default output format. So we can leave that as is. Now we are ready to start creating our bucket, setting permissions on that bucket, and then ultimately uploading those files that we created at the beginning of the tutorial, the HTML distribution files and the style.css, and then serving it. So let's get started. Before we create our bucket, we've just got to do one more thing, and that is we need to get our hands on a domain, because the naming of our bucket in the example that I'm going to show is going to use the domain that you're going to use. So navigate to cloudflare.com/sign up. I'll leave the link in the description. Create an account, and then we'll go through and we'll purchase a domain. This is the only thing that's going to cost anything. Everything else with Cloudflare here, just like with the Amazon free tier, we'll be using the free account. And it's only if you surpass a certain threshold that you're going to be incurring costs. Go ahead, sign up, and I'll see you on the other side. Once you've signed into your Cloudflare account, it should look a little bit similar to this, although you won't have a site set up yet. I've got an existing site, which is my blog, radleylewis.com. I'm going to add a new site though, because I need a new site, actually, as chance may have it, for a company that I recently set up. So I'm going to use that as an example. I'm going to click on create a new site, and then I'm going to register a new domain. Now, you can register your domain elsewhere. There's nothing wrong with that. But in my case, just for the simplicity for this tutorial, I'm going to register it here. The company is Sidwell Technologies, and I'm going to purchase this one here, sidwelltechnologies.com. Go ahead and fill out all of your details, and then I'll see you on the other side. All right, once you've registered your domain, you should be presented with a screen like this. So I've set up sidwelltechnologies.com. For the moment, that's all we need to do in Cloudflare. We're going to come back here later. The important part is just to get that URL. So now let's head back to the command line interface where we've set up AWS. We're going to create our bucket, and then we're going to access our bucket within our browser. So now you've got a domain that you've registered with Cloudflare, and you are ready to create your S3 bucket and host your website files in that S3 bucket. So on the left-hand side, we've got a terminal. We've already set up AWS configure. So we've got the credentials set for the user here. And on the right-hand side, I'm logged in as the admin user into the AWS console. I'm in the Singapore region, and I'm going to go to S3. We can find S3 up here, looking for S3. And in here, we can see we actually don't have any buckets yet. So it's going to give us the introduction to this service. We could, of course, create the bucket here, but we're going to do it using the command line. So for that, I'm going to paste in a command, and I'll explain what this command is doing. So we've got AWS. That's obviously the AWS CLI tool that we installed earlier. And then S3, that is the subcommand. And MB stands for make bucket. So in my case, I registered the domain sidwelltechnologies.com. So I need to put in s3://sidwelltechnologies.com. Then the region that I'm using is AP Southeast 1, which is Singapore, which is the closest to me, but you can always come in here and get any of the codes to the region that is closest to you. Now here, I'm going to hit enter. Now it's created this bucket, sidwelltechnologies.com. So if we were to refresh this page on the right-hand side, we'll now see under buckets that we have a bucket, but let's click on this bucket. Obviously this bucket is empty. It doesn't have what they call objects in it. And if we go to the permissions, all public access is blocked. So the next step, of course, is to upload our contents or the basic website that we created earlier. And I'm in the website project. So I'm going to change into the dist directory that we created. And in here, you'll recall we've got the index.html and then the static directory with the style.css. So the way that we're going to do this, we're going to say AWS S3, and then we're going to use the copy command, CP. We're going to copy this directory, and then we're going to put it in that same bucket that we're looking at. So s3://sidwelltechnologies.com. And then we're going to say recursive because we want all of the files in here to be uploaded. So I'm going to do that. We can see we got confirmation that the index.html file was uploaded and also the style.css. So if I refresh this over here, we'll now see that we've got these two files uploaded and available. That's great. We've got these files uploaded, but let's see if we can access these in a browser tab. And here we're going to construct our URL as sidwelltechnologies.com.s3.ap southeast 1 Amazon AWS.com. Now keep in mind, of course, you'd replace the domain here with your domain, and then you'd also replace this AP Southeast 1 with your region. But nevertheless, here I've tried to access the files there and I'm getting access denied. That's because presently we don't have public access on this bucket. That's not ideal. We want to be able to serve this. And so the next thing that we need to do is we need to allow the public access. The way that we're going to do this is by running another command. I'm just going to show you that command here. Let's clear this. Now this command is AWS S3 API, and then we're going to put, meaning update, public access block. So the bucket is obviously sidwelltechnologies.com, and the public access block configuration is that we want to block public policy set to false. So presently that's set to true. Let's run that. Okay, now if we come to permissions in here, you'll see that now block public access is actually turned off. Now, of course, this isn't ideal. We want to ordinarily give tighter restrictions on who can access the bucket, but we're going to tighten it up in a moment. We obviously want to tighten it up, but what are we going to do before we can access the bucket is we need to provide a bucket policy. We're going to be updating this policy. So I've created a script specifically for this purpose. So I'm going to go back, and in here, I'm going to go to the update bucket policy script, and this is what it looks like. So it's a bash script. Of course, you could run this directly from the command line, but because we're going to be coming back to this, I've created a very simple script. We've got the same AWS S3 API, and we're going to put the bucket policy. The bucket is going to be this name, sidwelltechnologies.com. So of course you can include your own. And then in here, the important part is the statement. So we're going to allow anyone public read get objects. So any of these objects in here will be readable, and they'll be really readable by anybody. So this is the specific action, and it's going to be anything in the root of the bucket. Great. So let's quit out of that. You'll obviously need to create the script yourself. And when you do that, don't forget to change this to be an executable. So once you've created your update policy, just make sure that you run this chmod to make the file executable. And when you have a look at that file, you can see that the X here indicates that it is executable. Okay, so I'm going to run this update bucket policy, and we're going to see in here when we refresh the page that we have, now you can see that we've got this bucket policy. Now the last step here is that we need to tell AWS or configure this bucket to act as a website. And for that, we've got one last command. So let's clear this. And that command is going to be AWS S3 and website. We're going to once again provide S3 and then the bucket name and then the index document. So if we go back to our objects, we know that the entry point to our application is this index.html file. Okay, so I'm going to run this command. Now, previously, when we got access denied, we were looking at S3. So now we've got to provide S3 website. Okay, so be sure to put HTTP at the beginning of your URL. So just for clarity, we've got http://sidwelltechnologies.com. So you would replace your domain with yourdomain.com or whatever it may be, followed by .s3-website to indicate that this is the website version, and then .ap southeast1.amazonaws.com. And of course, you'd replace AP Southeast 1 with your region. So congratulations, you're serving the content of your website to the web, and anyone could visit this. We've got a few issues though. It's not secure. As you can see here, it's only using HTTP, and it doesn't use your domain. And that's where we're going to be using Cloudflare. We're almost done setting up our S3 bucket. In fact, we've created the one with sidwelltechnologies.com, or in your case, yourdomain.com or whatever it is. You've uploaded your files. You've set the policy so it's available to everyone at the moment, although we will come back to that. However, there is one more thing that we need to do, because we may be accessing this from the Apex domain or from some kind of prefix like www. And then your domain. So we're going to create a second bucket, and we're going to call that www.yourdomain. So for example, in my case, it was www.sidwelltechnologies.com. Any requests going to this www bucket are going to be redirected to this one, which is where our content is hosted. The steps are the same. So let's go ahead and let's create that bucket. Okay, so for the first step, we're going to use the AWS S3 MB for make bucket, and we're going to create this new bucket. It's going to be www.sidwelltechnologies.com. The region, AP Southeast 1, Singapore for myself, or whatever region you're using. Hit that. All right, so we've created this bucket. Now, we don't need to upload any files to this document, to this bucket. because our files are all going to be hosted at sidwelltechnologies.com or the main bucket. But we do need to give public access. So let's go ahead and we're going to use that same command that we did before, but this time for our new bucket. Okay, so once again, that command was AWS S3 API put public access block and then the bucket, which is going to be www.yourdomain. And we're going to set the block public policy to false this time. And then in the final step, let's go into our update bucket policy. And we're just going to update the name here. So it's going to be www. and then your domain. We'll get out of that. And we're going to run that update bucket policy script. And there we go. Now, we're almost ready to go back to Cloudflare. If I come over here and I refresh this, we will see that we now, and I'll expand this for you, we've now got 2 buckets. Now, what we need to do is go to our first one and go to the properties. You scroll right down the bottom, you can just grab the URL. We learned earlier how we construct it ourselves, but just for clarity and to ensure there's no errors, just copy that. Now go back to our buckets and go to the new bucket that you've created. This time we're going to leave this one blank, but we will go to properties. And if we scroll down to the bottom, we're going to see that we can set this up for static website hosting. We're going to hit edit, enable, and in here, we're going to say, we're going to redirect requests for an object. And in there, we're going to paste in the bucket name. We can remove the HTTP, and we're going to redirect all requests to this bucket, the www bucket, to the bucket which is hosting the files. Save those changes. You can leave this protocol to none. That's fine. Once that's done, we can come back to this bucket, and just to ensure that it's working, come down to the bottom, grab the URL for the newly created bucket which redirects, and you'll see that it redirects to the same bucket contents. Almost everything is set up with AWS, although we are going to be coming back at the end just to tighten up the resource public get restrictions on who can read objects in our bucket. But now we're ready to move across to Cloudflare and get our DNS records set up so they're pointing to the buckets that we've created here. So we have our main bucket. We have the policy for the Cloudflare IP set for our main bucket, and then we have our redirect bucket for our www prefix. Now, the last thing that we need to do is come back to the Cloudflare dashboard. And in here, if you didn't create a site before, go ahead and create one. Or if you did, you should see it here in the dashboard. Here, I can see my site, and you can see that it's on the free plan. But let's click on the site. You'll be presented with an overview. And in here, it's important that we go to the DNS records. Specifically, we want to add 2 records. One is the CNAME for the root. So in this case, we're simply going to say @ and then we're going to provide the bucket for the hosted file. So if you recall, you had the first bucket that we spun up. You want to provide the URL for that bucket here. You can remove the HTTP at the beginning, and you can remove the trailing / So make sure that you've got that. And then you've got the second CNAME, which is www. In that case, you're going to direct it to the target, which is your second bucket that you created. Once again, you can remove the HTTP, and you can remove the trailing / at the end. So make sure that those both look right. And then under here, you can make sure that you've got SSL TLS encryption, and you can set that to flexible because Amazon's not taking care of that for us. And finally, the moment of truth, the thing that we've been waiting for. You go to another tab in your browser and go to the URL that you've chosen, and you'll see that your connection is being served. The connection is secure, and the content that we've uploaded to the Amazon S3 bucket is being served via your domain. So congratulations, you've got your website up and running, and now you can do whatever you want in there. You can change the HTML and CSS. In this last section, we're going to be tightening up our security by only giving read access to the buckets that we've created to the IP addresses that Cloudflare has publicly published and made available to us. So, for example, we only want read requests from these IPs, which are available at cloudflare.com/IPs, to be accepted. And if they're not from these addresses, we want them to be rejected. Before, we created that batch script. So we're going to use that to update our bucket policies to include all of these IP addresses. Let's go ahead and let's go into that file that we had, update bucket policy, and we're going to first do our root bucket, which contains all of our files, and we're going to make a few changes here. Specifically, under resource, we're going to include a condition, and we're going to say that we want to, so let's say condition, and this is going to be an object. And here what we're going to say is we're going to say IP address, and I'm going to say AWS source IP, so that's the source of the request for the IP. And then here we're going to have all of these IPs. So I'm going to copy this across. Okay, so I've copied over these IPs from the Cloudflare published IPs, including their IP v6 and v4. The only thing is this isn't valid JSON. We need to actually wrap this in quotes, and for that I'm going to use Vim. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to use the substitute command. We're going to say that we want to substitute, and we want to find the blank characters, right? And then what we want to say is we actually want to reset that because we only want to get anything starting from the number. So for example, see how these have got 103, 162 and so forth. So what we're going to say is we want to match the digit, and then we want to match everything from that digit, and we want to match it all the way till the end of the line. So I'm going to say like that, and it's matching everything I want, but just for good practice, I'm going to use $sign for the end of the line. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want to wrap that in quotes. I can use the ampersand, which references what we've matched, and I'm going to put quotes there. And then at the end, I'm going to put a comma. And finally, we're going to close that and submit. So now we can see, and just for the last line, we'll remove the comma, that we have wrapped this here in quotation marks. And this is valid JSON. So we've set all of that up. Let's quit out and let's run our update bucket policy. Now I'm back in the S3 services in the AWS console. I'm going to go to Sidwell Technologies, and let's have a look at the permissions. And we should see that we have the IPs here listed. And so if we now were to go and try to access this, we come down to properties, we use that URL. Because we are not accessing it from the IPs provided by Cloudflare, we're going to be denied access. So that's what we wanted. So now what we will do is we'll go and we'll update that bucket policy again. We're going to apply the same things to the redirected www prefix bucket. Let's quit that and let's go ahead and update the bucket policy there. We can come back to our buckets. And once again, we can see that the same policy has been applied here.